Hello everybody, my name is Danny and today I want to talk about generations. I don't know about you, but I have had issues with how we determine generations for years. In fact, nearly a decade probably since the first time I really thought about it. So one of my issues is how arbitrary it is, right? The general principle is based off actually something that's pretty freaking archaic, and that is the concept. Well, actually, I shouldn't say archaic. It's pretty old. It's definitely not archaic. It's not that far back that was still a thing. But digression. The point is that it's still a pretty old thing. Basis it's based off of that has been extinct for at least a good probably around 40 years. Well, nearly extinct, and that is the concept of people getting married are between 16 and 20 years of age and actually having their first children between 16 and 20 years of age. And that's pretty freaking arbitrary because it's based off of that. That's why you have 20-year blocks arbitrarily selected for each generation. That's the most common thing you'll see. An example, you might have Gen X be between 1980 and 2000. Though a big problem I have with that, and I mean you might be able to understand this too at this point with this context, is I was born in 1994. My eldest brother, God rest his soul, was born in 1980. My other brother is born in 1982. My sister is born in 1991. That puts us all across the same generation. And if you didn't notice, there's quite a bit. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but there's also quite a big ass difference between somebody born in the early 80s and somebody who's born in the early 90s. There's quite a big difference culturally, thought process wise, etc. That would make that Gen X. That would make me Gen X along with my eldest brother, or let's just say my brothers, which, again, like I just explained, doesn't really make that much sense. Now, those that are the experts in the industry, if you can even call it that, that determine generations, those that realized they felt that was too arbitrary, like, well, this is too arbitrary. Why does it have to start at the beginning and end on the end of a decade, right? So they're like, okay, well, it could start, say, 1975 and go to 1995 instead, or it could go, blah blah blah. But then there was others off of that one who said, well, that's also too arbitrary. Why can't it, be less than 20 years? In fact, it doesn't make sense to make it 20 years. Let's make it 15. And then off of that, there's the least common of those three, and that is the ones who decided to shrink it down all the way down to a decade, just 10 years per generation, which to me is still far too arbitrary and still doesn't make any sense. See, generations are actually very fluid. They don't have a set number that they would fit with. So to just say, oh, well, Gen Z is between 2000 and 2020, or 2000 and 2012, or whatever, it doesn't really work unless you adapt that age to fit the mindsets, the thought processes, the social cues and expectations and tendencies and belief tendencies and so on and so forth, all these different details about that generation of people. Because it's going to change over time, depending on when you're born, what you're around, your influences are. Of course, your mindset's going to tend more likely to be influenced and thus kind of be more in flow with that culture, that mindset, that belief system, that thought process, whatever. And so as a result, since they're fluid like that, it means that actually generations are not an arbitrary set of years that you can just apply it to. It actually should be adapted to fit the mindset, the culture, the beliefs, the thinking processes, etc. of said generations. So, an example, I would argue that Gen X should be between, again, say 1980 and probably 1990, I would say, actually. And another example, I would say millennials are probably best described as somewhere between 1990 or 1992 and about 1998 to 1999. Gen Z would be, 1990 or 1999, 2000, probably more around 2000 to 2002, up through 2012 to 15 or so. an example. Another one is it would fit best for baby boomers to be between, I would say, 1960 and 72, probably. Because those people that came of age or were close to coming of age by the time it was the late 70s and early 80s, like my mom said, was already kind of homeless socially, culturally, politically, thought wise, etc., because they just came from the counterculture revolution and make peace not love, or make love not war, and peace and love generation, free love generation, commune generation, etc. You know what I mean? The back to earthers, the mother earthers, whatever you want to call it, because they are the whole shtick of the 60s, the true real hippie era movement was actually specifically counterculture. It was to counter everything that was norm, everything that was normal, everything that was typical. That was the entire thing, but that was the adult generation of the 60s. It wasn't in the coming of age, basically like say 15-year-olds through 30-year-olds. And that was the bulk of that generation. And so at that point, that gives you that generation. What is the true hippie generation? Well, it wasn't people that were born in the 60s, it was people who were between 50 and 30 in the 60s. So then you can go back, do the math. I'm too white to do that on the fly. And figure out, okay, that's the baby boomer generation or the hippie generation. The Mother Earther generation, whatever you'd like to term the title you want to give them for that. An example. One of the keystones of, say, Gen X is the concept and idea that they're going to pretty much embody the 80s, the era they grew up in. So they love 80s shit. They love original hip-hop and rap. That's so common. And if it's not that, then it's probably more likely metal, although that's usually people who are born later in that generation. So that's a slight divergence. And then they, a lot of times, will love the idea of wearing like a leather jacket or a puffer coat or something like that, or puffer jacket, a vest, right? Puffy vest or something. Have their hair slicked back in an undercut or something like that, They're the more, I would call them true hipsters. They're more like that. That's like 80s generation, so that's very Gen X-y. That's a very, very common denominator. They're super into Doctor Who. They're super into, Star Wars. They're super into Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. All these different sci-fi things from back then, and that's their shit. That's cliche-ly Gen X. Millennials were the ones who had the cliche joking, especially the earlier millennials, about PDA, but it wasn't public displays of affection like everybody thinks it is now. It was, a personal device assistant, I think is what it stood for. Those little computers, like, you flip it open, you have a little stylus you pull out, and, and that would usually be in tandem with a pager, which, by the way, still do exist. They're still made. It's just almost exclusively medical people who use it in hospitals. Apparently, almost every medical hospital out there in the U.S. still uses pagers. And also, I think in the U.K., I heard, was still a thing. And it's basically the only people who use pagers. But, we're the ones who make jokes about that kind of stuff. At the same time, we're the ones who, unfortunately, had well, depending on who you are, I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, for me it's unfortunately, you had to grow up with a frog being extremely popular at the top, which the frog is incorrectly referred to as Britney Spears. Yeah. Genie in a bottle, baby. What is that? And then there's Christina Aguilera and all that shit. You had like the sudden complete takeover of pop music as a genre rather than just simply meaning popular music. It was actually a genre at that point. It got totally hijacked by the industry, and now everybody had to become a pop star. And so music died with our generation, pretty much, unfortunately. And that's when everything was getting all electronic and everybody was suddenly required to use, even if they had extreme musical talent, singing-wise, they had to use freaking auto-tune and so the stupid editing. Music died with my generation, with the millennial generation. That's a fact. Like, that's a cliche. Another huge cliche, especially within my generation, it's like an inside thing, I guess, because a lot of people didn't really pay attention to that, was we were, just like actually Gen Z, or Gen X, sorry, has a similarity in that too. They're the ones who brought it up and had it rise in popularity. We're the ones who took that and ran with it and just made it go way up in popularity before it started plummeting right around Y2K. And that was card trading, but specifically in collecting. Specifically things like Neopets cards, Digimon, Pokemon, what is it, on Yu-Gi-Oh? Shit like that. And that's why you hear a lot of people within the millennial generation, or at the very tail end of Gen X, that are always talking or making some kind of a reference, whether it's a joke or not, about some kind of cards, whether it's Pokemon or Digimon or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or you almost never do hear Neopets cards, but they were a thing. I can promise you that. I had one that I found at Goodwill Outlet, of all places, for quite a while. It was clearly probably one that might have been worth something, but then again, nobody, it had really no popularity, so maybe it wouldn't have been. Then again, maybe it would have sometime in the future, if not now, because, again, it was so uncommon, right? So somebody might want to pay for it more. Who knows? Anyway, but that's another cliche of ours, obviously. So on and so forth. Like, yeah, there's a cliche for all of them, right? And so that's why I would say my argument would be for getting rid of any kind of hardline, structural, or materialist, what do you want to call that, concretist basis for it. It has to be a set number of years for each generation. No, it should be fluid. Because it is fluid. Every generation is very fluid. One generation could be 8 years in length. The next one could be 16, and another one could be literally 32 years. Like, I didn't mean to actually literally just do doubles, but you know what I mean. Like, an example, that literally is how generations really work. It just depends on the influences, how they work, how they think, how they believe, what they believe, etc. And the majority of them. How they function, how they interact with things, society, situations, etc. That's just very factually correct about how generations work. That's what makes a generation, because it makes them unique and different than the other ones that they could have been considered a part of, but clearly do not belong to. And that's how you figure out which ones are their own generation, and then from there, you can apply how long of a span it seems that people fit with that generation, however long it is. It could even be like 3 years. It's entirely possible. I don't think there's one that only lasted that long. But as short as something like, even 5 years, I know that there's at least probably 1 or 2 generations that lasted probably only 5 years before a big shift happened again. That's not at all remotely surprising or weird. So that's my argument against the current way that we use generations, because it doesn't make any actual sense. It's way too arbitrary. And then, obviously, also my argument for how it should work. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments below if you would agree, or what you would change, or what your concept is, if you feel so inclined to do so. And otherwise, stay safe out there, or not, it's your prerogative. If you want to get hit by a bus, you can. And I'll see you in hell. I'm kidding, it doesn't exist, but that's a different story. But I would like to be there if it did exist. Okay. Goodbye.